US media reporting that Ukraine has apparently accepted the American peace proposal. Let's talk to our international correspondent Alex Rossi and our defence and security analyst, Professor Michael Clarke, with me in the studio here. So, Alex, to you first of all. So this is, it seems like we've moved forwards according to American media, but we're not clear whether this is just a slight embellishment on what we knew last night. Tell us where we are with what we know about what Ukraine has agreed to.
Well, it is all fairly unclear. What is clear is that President Zelensky and the Ukrainians are in a difficult position, obviously have been for 11 years, since the Russians invaded Crimea and then the full-scale invasion. But this appears to be the answer to what Trump is putting forwards with his initiative. We're hearing, I'll just read you these lines, Rustem Umerov, the National Security Advisor, and a US official say that there is now an understanding on a proposal that has been reached, but details still need to be worked out. So let's rewind a little bit. The 28-point peace plan that the Americans kind of sort of sidelined everybody with when they came out with it, discussions in Geneva. Those discussions then led, we think, to a 19-point peace plan. The Ukrainians were saying after those meetings that they had kind of agreed to that. And now this appears to be confirmation of that. But of course, the big question in all of this is, will the Russians agree to the changed text on the 28-point peace plan? The likelihood is that that isn't going to happen. We've already heard from the Kremlin that anything that's acceptable to the Europeans would not be acceptable to the Russians. Their maximalist demands, of course, will have been watered down. So they are unlikely to go for it. So what we are seeing is diplomacy about how to deal with Donald Trump's diplomacy. The Ukrainians know that they cannot flatly say no to Donald Trump. They need to flatter him. They need to engage with the process. That's what seems to be happening here. They, of course, will hope that the Russians will reject this. That, again, though, is unlikely because Vladimir Putin knows the man that is Donald Trump very well, and he will know how to engage and how to deal with this ball when it comes back. He will likely say, it's a very complex situation. We need more time. We need further discussions. But yes, in theory, we are willing to go ahead with this. So that's where we stand at the moment.
Michael, do you concur with this, that although we haven't got to this stage before in terms of a peace proposal on the table, it is following the same pattern that we have seen in the negotiations, where Ukraine agrees to stuff, but then when it goes back to Russia, it all seems to get thrown into the long grass.
Square brackets. It's all about square brackets. That Kyslytsya, who's the Deputy Foreign Minister, said last night, he said, we've agreed the document, which means the 19 points that Alex was talking about is agreed, which is to say that's a document that can go back to the President. And in it are square brackets. So there's all the things we agree, and then the things that we're still stuck on are in square brackets. And the American report said a few minor details. No, the things in square brackets are the big issues, the things that they can't agree on. And so the idea is what's in square brackets is what President Zelensky and President Trump will have to talk about probably at the weekend or next week. When this big meeting happens in Washington, Zelensky goes to Washington, it'll be a really critical meeting. He's really got to go in and bat for his country because he'll have to deal with whatever's in the square brackets, the really big issues. How big will the armed forces be in Ukraine? What are they going to do about territory? Are they really going to give up the Donbass? It's a whole series of issues. Is Russia going to be the official second language? What about are war crimes going to be cancelled? All these hundreds of thousands of war crimes? I don't know, but I bet you that those are all the things in square brackets. And the things that are not in the brackets are what we agree on. That's fine. So there's a two-stage process, I think, which is that one is that Zelensky and Trump, or Zelensky's got to go to Trump and get some sort of American endorsement of this version, and then that version, with some American endorsement, goes to Russia and they reject it. And then we're back where we started. And the question then is, how angry is President Trump and who does he blame for the fact that this has run into the sand? That's where I think we're going sometime in the next 10 days. Might be wrong. I mean, maybe there'll be a breakthrough. Maybe there will. But the biggest meeting is the one between Zelensky and Trump, which is going to come up soon. Nobody's putting a date on it yet. It's got to be after Thanksgiving. So it's just about plausible. It might be over the weekend, more likely, I'm guessing, next week.
And Alex, do you think, I mean, if we do make progress on this, is this following the pattern of what we saw in Gaza, that Trump sends out his envoys, they get almost to the point, and then Trump goes out to sort of close the deal, as it were, and be there for all the big handshakes?
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to be kind about how this is working, he's putting everything out there. He's getting the wish list from the Russians of what they want. This starts as kind of the outer realms of what this discussion is going to be, and then you work backwards and you try and meet somewhere in between and you try and get a deal. But I mean, it's
the complete reversal of the way diplomacy normally works.
It's very, very, very unorthodox. I mean, normally, look, wind back for the Middle East peace process and look at Oslo. Weeks and weeks, months and months of negotiations between diplomats before anybody even got close to announcing anything. In this case, what we're seeing is just the huge announcement very, very quickly, and then actually people scratching their heads, what's all this about? This seems very far removed from the reality of where anybody thinks that an agreement can really be made practically. So, yeah, it's extraordinarily unorthodox. Will it work in this case? I think it is different to the totally, Gaza case.
Yeah. Much bigger issue.
Yeah. And also, I think the Ukrainians, contrary to what Donald Trump says, do actually have some cards to play. They do have European allies. Losing America completely would be a disaster, but not necessarily the end of the story. They still have a vote. They still have a say.
It's known as diplomacy by envoy, as opposed to diplomacy by diplomats. So the State Department is almost moribund in this case. The National Security Council in America is a shadow of its former self. And all the diplomacy has been worked out by envoys. In other words, somebody that Trump picks because he trusts them. They've come from a different area of business or whatever it might be. No diplomatic background, but they've got the president's ear, and he sends out these powerful people, powerful to him, and it's diplomacy by envoy. And professional diplomacy just stands aside and has to somehow pick up the pieces when the envoys have agreed something. It's completely different. It doesn't always go wrong. I mean, Richard Holbrooke was an envoy, and he was a really tough, vicious character. But my goodness, he knew his stuff. And, you know, he was in the 1990s and the year 2000s. And Holbrooke was a real bully, but he was effective because he did his background work. He had years of experience behind him. He was a really effective envoy. Some of these envoys have come from completely different areas, and they're thrown into world politics, and they're up against Russian professionals. You know, Russian professional diplomats who've been doing this for years. And, of course, they wipe the floor with them. I
mean, Lavrov is one of the most experienced diplomats in the world, and he's dealing with people like Steve Witkoff, so who's
a very nice man.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean to say he knows what he's talking about in diplomacy, but he's a genuinely nice man. Trump trusts him, and he's a good real estate man. But in the world of global politics, no.
I think the other thing that's worth bearing in mind, underpinning all of this, is the question about Donald Trump's attention span. If this doesn't go his way, if momentum doesn't gather, if this initiative doesn't look as though it is going towards a solution, what does he do next? Does he just lose interest and walk away? I mean, I think that's the big question.
Yeah. Well, we've been saying for a while, he's zigzagging his way out of this war.
Indeed.
And, you know, all zigzags, and the zigzags matter because whether he's on a zig or a zag when he leaves the whole scene will depend on who he blames.
It's getting a bit Spice Girls in here. Let's cross to Washington and bring in US correspondent David Blevins, put some of those points to him. David, so this is about President Trump's attention span, whether he's ziggy-zagging, but also about these envoys that he sent. And in terms of what you're hearing, do you feel that there's been movement from the position where we were last night, that we knew that Ukraine had agreed to what was currently on the table?
Yes, well, good morning, Jane. It's very early in the morning here, so forgive me. I haven't heard everything Alex and Michael had to say prior to this, so maybe a little repetitive. I think it is worth stressing, though, that we are hearing from the Americans, but we've not yet heard from the Ukrainians or from the Russians. So this is far from a peace deal at this stage. And remember, Donald Trump appears to have the ability to negotiate terms with Ukraine or to negotiate terms with Russia, but getting to a point where there are terms acceptable to both is an entirely different thing. But given that several US news networks are reporting on this side of the Atlantic this morning that there has been progress towards a deal, I think we can safely say this is a coordinated briefing from the administration, and you've got to ask why. Presumably it is designed to put pressure on the Russians at this stage. But of course, the Russians have never shown any weakness in terms of that kind of pressure in the past. So often these things are about the optics. Whenever the administration here in Washington tells us that there is progress or that there has been a breakthrough from one side or the other, very often it just continues to be part of the negotiating process. We have reached out to the Ukrainians but haven't heard from them yet. What we do know, of course, is that President Zelensky is preparing now to travel to the United States. If that's going to be in the next few days, then that crunch meeting with President Trump will take place not in Washington but in Florida. The president is due to depart the capital for his Mar-a-Lago estate at West Palm Beach this evening. He's going to spend Thanksgiving there. Perhaps he has some hopes of a Thanksgiving agreement, but right now from this side of the Atlantic it seems we're still some distance from that.
David, that's interesting that you think it's entirely possible that the Zelensky meeting could happen, despite the fact that it's Thanksgiving, Black Friday, then it's the weekend. America traditionally shuts down for a period of time. But do you think it could happen anyway?
Jane, I think it's fair to say that often there are logistics being put in place that are not reportable, but certainly the administration is preparing for all eventualities on this side of the Atlantic. The President today will participate in a Thanksgiving ceremony and then will depart the White House for Mar-a-Lago. We know he's going to be there, we think, right through until Sunday, but there's a possibility, we understand, that President Zelensky would travel to Florida rather than to Washington to engage in these talks if they are making the kind of progress the administration is suggesting at this stage. But as always, it's a bit like reading the tea leaves, because we know how complicated, to say the least, the relationship has been between Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky. Remember that showdown in the Oval Office back in February? Then we had the mending of their differences, the building of bridges, I think you could say, at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome on the edge of Pope Francis' funeral. And then just last month, Zelensky was back at the Oval Office. I was outside. It was very cordial, the press conference. You can see pictures of it on your screen there. But yet we heard just a few hours later that it had descended into a shouting match, with President Trump throwing maps around the room that President Zelensky had presented him with as he was discussing perhaps the division of territory in the future. So it's always been very complicated, but perhaps President Zelensky and European leaders have learned with President Trump that it's best not to just reject his ideas out of hand, but to go along with them, so to speak, to appear at least to be on side, so that if a blame is to land somewhere, it doesn't land on you.
David, sage advice. Thanks very much. Well, let's just remind ourselves what's happened in the last hour. Speaking in the Commons, the Prime Minister said that there was a tough road ahead to end the war, but that the UK was more committed than ever to the cause.
I welcome the continued efforts of the United States to end the war and stop the killing. The initial draft of the 28-point plan included points that were not acceptable, but also some very important elements that will be essential for a just and lasting peace. For example, it sets out steps on security guarantees from the US and partners. This is very significant, and the discussions in Geneva took important steps forward, with progress between the US and Ukraine on an updated peace framework. I can reassure the House that work is ongoing to refine this plan. Mr. Speaker, we're clear about the fundamental principles here, that Ukraine's sovereignty must be maintained, that Ukraine should be able to defend herself in future, and that matters about Ukraine and its future must be determined by Ukraine. Yeah. We are clear their voice must always be at the heart of the process.
Well, let's bring in our political correspondent, Mari Aurora. And Mari, a reiteration of the UK's support for Ukraine, and also the Prime Minister hosting this Coalition of the Willing meeting a little later on today.
Yeah, absolutely, Jane. A reiteration of no change in stance from the UK when it comes to steadfast support for Ukraine. And as in that clip the PM was outlining, he talked about how there were some elements of this 28-point plan that we saw emerge over the weekend that were not acceptable. And he was clear to say that over the weekend and wanted to clearly reiterate that. But also, he said it did take important steps forward. I think what was interesting also was when he was outlining some of those kind of conditions that needed to be met in order for a just and lasting peace to prevail in Ukraine. He did talk about sovereignty for Ukraine being maintained. He did talk about Ukraine being able to defend itself in the future, and also that all matters around and about Ukraine and its future must be determined by Ukraine. But there was also a fourth point that he made a little bit later on, where he said elements relating to Europe and NATO will need the consent of Europe and NATO members. And those elements really are potentially the slightly more thorny, slightly more tricky elements of this peace plan were it to go ahead and really be implemented. And that is because, of course, while you might have the US administration negotiating with Ukraine and also with Russia, as soon as anything to do with the Europeans or NATO, of course, comes into play, you need to have the kind of consent and the green light, as it were, from those bodies and those nations as well. And that's when you need more people around the table. And it was something that the PM was really keen to stress. Also, an interesting line in what he said later on as well. He insisted there is still a long way to go and a tough road ahead, which is interesting because while he was talking, US media, as you've outlined, Jane, was reporting that Ukraine has agreed to a peace plan with the US, and that doesn't necessarily chime with the rhetoric the PM was saying around there still being a long way to go and a tough road ahead. And then actually the PM was asked in the chamber specifically about those US media reports, and his response was, I'll have a look at the report and look behind the headline. If there is anything material to report, I will, of course, do it. So clearly he is sceptical as to whether some of these reports are necessarily quite as breakthrough-like as they might suggest. And as also David Blemmers was arguing, is this also Donald Trump perhaps trying to strong-arm the Russians or even the Ukrainians into a position? But for now, the PM is reserving judgment on some of those US reports.
Mari, thank you very much for that. Well, let's bring in Robert Clarke now, fellow at the Yorktown Institute and director of the Defence and Security Unit at the think tank Civitas. Very good to talk to you today, Robert. Do you feel that we are as close as we have been up to now to peace in Ukraine?
Good afternoon. I think we are close or closer, but I have to hesitate, some form of trepidation. This is going to be a very long road ahead. From the back of these, what appear now to be 19 points putting forward, particularly by the Europeans and the UK, who need to have a much stronger voice in this to try and counter, obviously, some of Russia's demands, which I think the Europeans are far better placed to have in private with the administration in Washington than directly calling them out in public, for instance. I think we're getting there, but I think it's going to be a very long road ahead, for sure.
I mean, is the UK in the room, as it were, on the talks, in the sense that, if there has been genuine progress that the Americans have announced to the media in the last hour or so, and yet Keir Starmer, the first he hears of it is when an MP on another bench raises it in the Commons. What is your reading of that?
Oh, for sure. That's a very interesting point. I think, look, Keir Starmer as the Prime Minister is understandably at most points, first and foremost, in these conversations, but there are plenty of other people in diplomatic channels with Washington and in Kyiv who are doing the heavy lifting, so to speak. I know Keir Starmer had a phone call this morning with President Zelensky in Ukraine, really detailing the sort of aspects of a UK force in Ukraine post-conflict resolution. So that's the role for the UK to play, is a leader in Europe with France and with Germany in terms of some form of security assistance for Ukraine. And crucially, that involves the United States, the details of which we're still waiting to hear. But there must be some form of hard deterrence from the United States, partnered with Europe, in particular the UK, to really afford Ukraine that security going forwards.
As I'm talking to you, Robert, we're just getting some lines coming from Ukrainian officials talking to the Reuters news agency. They have told Reuters that Ukraine supports the essence of the peace deal's framework following the Geneva talks, and that the most sensitive issues of the framework to be discussed between Zelensky and Trump. So you've already touched on the security guarantees from America, but the other sensitive issues would be the number of troops in Ukraine and what territory will be ceded, if any.
No, precisely. I think the biggest question for Ukraine going forwards, particularly for its people, is how unpalatable it will be, but necessary, unfortunately, nonetheless, particularly in the short term, how much territory of Ukraine is ceded to Russian control. Ukraine is limited legally, constitutionally, by how much ground it can cede. And I think President Zelensky has already made clear this would be almost a temporary acknowledgement of Russian control, not overhanding Ukrainian territory for good. I think there'll be an enormous diplomatic and covert military effort in Europe going forwards to see some sort of reunification in the next 5 to 10 years.
Robert, really good to get your thoughts today. Thank you so much for joining us. Robert Clarke there from Civitas. Well, let's return to our international correspondent, Alex Rossi, and our defence and security analyst, Professor Michael Clarke. Michael, I'll come to you first of all. So a certain amount of guarded optimism, I suppose you'd say, there from Robert, like you, somebody who's watched what's been happening there very, very closely. Yeah,
I mean, it's going forward, and President Trump is very keen to build on what he feels is the success in Gaza, to move on to the really tough one, which is Ukraine. Clearly something is happening. I'm pretty sceptical it will do anything other than run into the sand eventually, because I don't think the Russians will agree to it, because the Russians don't want to stop fighting. They think that they'll get more out of continuing to fight, but they don't want to antagonise the United States too much. So my own interpretation is that all this is about shifting the blame, is making sure that Europe or Russia or Ukraine are not going to take the blame when this thing runs out of steam. But having said that, diplomacy is a very funny process. I mean, things can happen unexpectedly, and in the Trump era, things happen very quickly and unexpectedly, so you can't rule out anything. But I think objectively, we're still where we were in March, when we had the big meetings in March that was going to be a ceasefire, and then suddenly the ceasefire became a peace plan. And that's, ceasefire is easier to arrange. We said, just stop and let's talk about everything. But the Russians don't want to do that. They want a peace plan because they think that by a peace plan, they'll be able to interpret the peace plan as Ukrainian surrender. And so that's, in a sense, where we are now. But in terms of diplomatic process, we're no nearer to agreement than we were in March. And Zelensky has said, from March, he said, I will agree an unconditional ceasefire, land, sea and air. He didn't start that way, but he said, that's it, we'll agree it. And Putin is the one who can always find reasons not to agree to the ceasefire. And here we are in November, end of November. I think we'll still be here in February, March, into next year.
Depressing, very interesting.
I'm afraid so. It's not the worst outcome. It's not a good outcome, but it could get worse yet. I mean, this is not the worst outcome, just to go around in a circle and have Ukraine carrying on fighting with American help. And the great problem of this, I mean, The Economist actually put it quite well this week. They said that the Ukrainians won't surrender and the Russians don't know how to win. So both can keep on fighting. If the Russians knew how to win, they'd win, but they don't. And the Ukrainians have no choice, but they feel, but to carry on fighting. So they don't know how to win either, because they're not in a position to. They're too small, but they won't surrender. And the Russians, with their superiority, can't make it tell to actually win.
Alex, you're international correspondent, but back in the midst of time, you were the Moscow correspondent. I mean, what do you think is going on in Russia at the minute? How do you think they're regarding where we are with these talks?
Well, I mean, like Michael says, I think the Russians believe that they are winning on the battlefield. They can continue. They've got nothing to lose by carrying on doing that. It's an attritional war. Yes, they are losing an enormous amount of blood and treasure, but I think the calculation in Moscow is that they can carry on for the foreseeable. They see Zelensky in not a very good position with Donald Trump. They also see this corruption scandal whipping around his government. They see his position as being weakened. Why not take what effectively, really, I mean, if you look at the 28-point peace plan, is something of a gift for them, really. They can go ahead with it. They don't lose anything. But Zelensky has everything to lose. If he is seen as the rejectionist by the Americans, you may see American support, what still remains, just evaporate completely, and Donald Trump walk off. But I think certainly the Russian calculation, despite all of the problems that they're facing economically and on the battlefield, I think the calculation is carry on. We can get more. We are winning this war.
Michael, as we're talking, we're getting lines dropping from the German Chancellor saying that Merz spoke with Ukraine Zelensky on the phone today as well. European diplomacy is still going on. I mean, what would be the best way for Europe to deal with this in terms of Trump? Is it best to sort of leave America to sort it out or to meddle?
No, I mean, what they're trying to do, and I think there's a lot of moving parts at the moment, things going on in the coalition of the willing and talks in Abu Dhabi and so on, is that the Europeans are trying to line up behind Zelensky to give him as much diplomatic backing as possible, to indicate to the United States that, you know, it would be a mistake, President Trump, to isolate Zelensky, because ultimately we, the Europeans, have no choice, we feel, but to back him. Because this is our security we're talking about. This is not just a regional war, maybe a regional war to you sitting in Washington, but this is our neighbourhood. And we're going to have to live in this neighbourhood, you know, after this war is finished, in whatever way it finishes. So the message from the Europeans to the Americans is, please understand our position. We have no choice but to support Ukraine against this naked aggression. Of course, we want to do it in a way that doesn't fracture the transatlantic relationship. And we want to do everything we can, Mr. President, to support your peace efforts, which are wonderful. You know, and if privately we don't really believe they'll go anywhere, we will give them as fair a wind as we can. We'll do all that we can to help your peace efforts. But if they're not going to work, they're not going to work. And if they collapse, we will still have to support Ukraine. And that's kind of everyone was rude about the coalition of the willing, say how ridiculous it is and troops going into Ukraine. The point is there was a public version of the coalition of the willing to help the peace process, and the less public version they don't talk about, which is to support Ukraine if peace is not possible, which I don't think it will be.
Alex, you know, what happens now, do you think? We're just going to have to wait and see for, you know, in terms of whether or not we get word out of Zelensky?
Yeah, I mean, I think you wait and see. I mean, I think there are still quite a few days in all of this in terms of the negotiations. Remember, the original date was for Thanksgiving, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah. It's Thursday.
Which is Thursday, yeah. Which isn't very long. That appears to have receded, so Ukraine and, I suppose, the European allies now have a bit more breathing space. But perhaps another way of looking at all of this is actually, if this doesn't progress, what is plan B? And it appears that will be more of the same, more fighting, more horror on the battlefield, and something really that appears to be pretty much devoid of strategy beyond hoping that there is some kind of black swan event in Moscow that makes them think, oh, this is a terrible error. We really need to withdraw from Ukraine because our own country is going to collapse. But people have been, I mean, that's a scenario that has been put forward for the last few years, and it hasn't transpired. So we'll see.
We'll get you to pause there, Alex, because it is 2 o'clock. Very good afternoon. We start with breaking news, and in the past few minutes, a Ukrainian official has told the Reuters news agency that they support the essence of a peace proposal brokered by the Trump administration following talks in Geneva at the weekend. Washington sent its initial 28-point peace plan to Kyiv last week before officials from both countries drafted a counter-proposal at crisis talks in Geneva. Meanwhile, Sir Keir Starmer says he spoke to President Zelensky this morning ahead of a virtual coalition of the willing meeting later this afternoon. Talking in the Commons in the past hour, the Prime Minister said that there was a tough road ahead to end the war, but that the UK was more committed than ever to the cause.
I welcome the continued efforts of the United States to end the war and stop the killing. The initial draft of the 28-point plan included points that were not acceptable, but also some very important elements that will be essential for a just and lasting peace. For example, it sets out steps on security guarantees from the US and partners. This is very significant, and the discussions in Geneva took important steps forward, with progress between the US and Ukraine on an updated peace framework. I can reassure the House that work is ongoing to refine this plan. Mr. Speaker, we're clear about the fundamental principles here, that Ukraine's sovereignty must be maintained, that Ukraine should be able to defend herself in future, and that matters about Ukraine and its future must be determined by Ukraine. We are clear their voice must always be at the heart of the process.
Well, responding for the Conservatives, Kemi Badenoch said Vladimir Putin and Russia must not be welcomed back into the international fold following any deal.
Putin's relentless bombardment of Kyiv and KGB-style negotiating tactics show he is not serious about peace, which is why Russia must not be welcomed back into the international fold without a comprehensive peace agreement. We all want this terrible war to end. And as the Prime Minister rightly said, Elements of that draft 28-point plan were unacceptable. Conservatives are clear that the blanket surrender of Ukrainian territory would mean rewarding Putin's unprovoked aggression.
Well, we don't know exactly the current state of the proposals that Ukraine are said to have agreed to, but these are some of the points that the European leaders were pushing for during talks in Geneva at the weekend. Among them, a security guarantee for Ukraine from the United States that mirrors NATO's Article 5, which states that an attack on one member is an attack on all. Ukraine would not be allowed to recover its occupied territory through military means, and negotiations on territorial swaps would begin at the present front line. The Ukrainian military would be capped at 800,000, but only in peacetime. According to the US plan, that cap would be 600,000, even in times of war. NATO would not permanently station its troops in Ukraine in peacetime, and Ukraine would be compensated financially through Russian assets, which would remain frozen until compensation had been paid. Plus, Ukraine would hold elections as soon as possible after the signing of any peace agreement. Well, let's bring in our defence and security analyst, Professor Michael Clarke, who is with me now, and also our international correspondent, Alex Rossi, who's here also. Michael, to you first. It feels like progress has been made, but fundamentally we don't know what is in this document that Ukraine has agreed to, do we?
No, it's a sense of momentum, and that's welcome. And so we know that the European version of this document, the 28 points that was drafted in Miami, is now more or less gone. There's a 19-point document, which we don't know the details of, and it's right that we don't know. I mean, the problem with that 28-point document, there are too many copies of it kicking around, and so it leaked, and the Russians leaked it, and then there were copies everywhere. This 19-point document, the draft, apparently there's only one draft, one copy of the draft for each member of the delegation. So there's probably only 3 or 4 physically in existence at the moment. And that's good diplomatic practice, thankfully. And that is fairly confidential until it gets back to Washington, and very few people should then see it. So we hope this thing doesn't leak until Ukraine and the United States come together to discuss it. So it looks as if this is a version of the 28 points which the Europeans and Ukraine could live with, and then if they can convince President Trump that that's a runner, then President Trump will then, as it were, talk to the Russians about it, and that's where the bigger problem will now be. So it's going to put the ball back into the court of President Putin, and he won't say very much. He never does. He'll keep quiet. He may make a few Delphic comments. And he won't say anything up front, and they'll just consider it, and then they'll tell you all the reasons why it's going to take a lot of time to work out the details and modalities. They won't rush at it, for sure, because they don't like it. And Russian commentators have already got on the record of saying, well, these European proposals, from what we see of them, what we understand, are completely unacceptable, because they were very happy with the 28 points originally, because we're now pretty sure they drafted them.
Well, indeed. And Alex, the next steps are that we think Zelensky will go to America. We think he will go and meet Trump, whether it's in the White House or whether it's down in Mar-a-Lago in Florida. But as Michael says, that's almost rubber stamping it. He's going to agree to it. It's what happens when it goes back to Putin.
Yeah, I mean, there may be difficult conversations for Vladimir Zelensky to have with Donald Trump. And we know that the history of the relationship is not particularly good. People will remember what happened in the Oval Office when he sat with J.D. Vance, the vice president, and Donald Trump. And we had the now infamous "you don't have any of the cards" conversations. But yeah, the likelihood is if he ends up in the United States and Donald Trump does see him, that it will move forward. So I think the gamble, if it is a gamble that the Ukrainians are taking, is that certainly there is much, even in the revised peace plan, that they do not like. But I think there's probably a calculation in Kyiv that the Russians won't accept it anyway, and then they will look like the people or the party to reject Donald Trump's plan. And that really is part of, if you want to call it a game, it's part of the game that's going on here.
But Zelensky will really have to be on his mettle when this meeting takes place, because, as I say, it's all about the square brackets. So they've got a document, it's normal diplomatic practice, and the things that are still outstanding that we can't agree on or that we think are a bigger issue are in square brackets. And in this case, I mean, what we're being briefed is that the stuff in the square brackets are things that only the leaders can decide. Lower-level officials, it's above their pay grade. So this is something that only Trump and Zelensky can really decide. So Zelensky will have to be on his mettle, because if he starts going through all the stuff in the square brackets, which are the critical issues for Ukraine, I can guarantee, then it's quite possible that President Trump, knowing the Russian position, knowing Vladimir Putin's position, who he's pretty friendly with, he'll say the Russians require you to do this, the Russians require that. And that might be a very, very awkward conversation. Somehow Zelensky has got to be able to manoeuvre Trump into a position where they end up with something that they can live with. And I think Alex is then right. The Russians will then reject it or find reasons that they can't accept it immediately. But the danger for Zelensky is that Trump will turn up, and if Putin gets to him before this meeting, or if Putin's people get to Trump before this meeting, or if J.D. Vance gets to him before this meeting, then Trump will be briefed on the things the Russians want in those square brackets, which are still outstanding.
Do we know what backup Zelensky will have when he goes to the White House? I mean, clearly he's got Europe behind him. There's this coalition of the willing, all supporting him. But as you say, it's having the psychological backup as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, he'll have his team around him, his advisors who will go with him. But in terms of the actual backing, I think it's an interesting point that you made about manoeuvring. He will hope, of course, that the European allies, people like President Macron, people like Prime Minister Keir Starmer, will have done that manoeuvring and prepared the way for him to make an argument which they then hope will fall on fertile ground. If it doesn't, we may see a reignition of that rather tempestuous exchange that we saw in the Oval Office. But that, I think, is the hope. But I think if it gets that far, I think he will understand that the agreement does have to be made. He'll take Andrei Yarmak with him for sure. I mean, he's his key advisor, and he relies on him a lot. And
he's been in the talks, hasn't he?
Yes, exactly, yeah. And Kyiv as well, the Deputy Foreign Minister. He's pretty influential. And I think, again, Zelensky trusts him. So there's 2 or 3 people that he will have close, that he will trust, and he'll need them to keep him. But whether they'll be around him when he actually has the conversation, we don't know.
And what do we know, Michael, about the relationship of those Ukrainian diplomats and the American envoy who's been across? How well has that gone?
Yeah, well, I mean, Yarmak is not that popular in Washington, because he's seen as a Zelensky man, and he's very tough-minded, and a lot of people don't trust him. So that might be slightly problematical. And as Alex said, I mean, I think when it comes to it, it might be Trump and maybe the vice president and Zelensky, sitting. I mean, that's the peril. That's the jeopardy. Another situation like we already witnessed. But Rustam Umerov, who was previous defence minister, again, he's been involved in this. And I'm not sure, I can't work out what he was doing, because it was said that he was involved in the Miami talks with Witkoff and Dmitriev. And I found that very odd, because what those talks produced this Russian draft. And if Umerov saw the draft, he couldn't possibly have said... Umerov has come out and denied that was the case. He's denied that he had any say or input to the original 28-point peace plan, the one that kind of took everybody by surprise. Yeah. But he's bound to be there. Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine Umerov would not be in Washington or Mar-a-Lago when it comes to it. So I think we know who the Ukrainians are likely to be on that trip. We don't know, this is the key issue, who is backing Trump up, because, without being rude to the man, I mean, he tends to say whatever the last person who spoke to him said. I mean, he's famously susceptible to that. And, of course, everybody around Trump knows that. So they're all sort of competing to be the last person in the room, if he is in the room on his own.
And in terms of the US delegation, we've already touched on it, but what is interesting about this diplomatically is that fundamentally a lot of the people there are not diplomats. Not at all, not at all. And there's a big argument going on now between Marco Rubio, who's the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, who's he's pretty anti-Putin. He always was before he went into the White House, and he's quite pro-Ukraine in his general orientation. And then against that, J.D. Vance, who's he's very anti-Ukraine. He doesn't like Zelensky. He was the one who started off the beating up of Zelensky on the 28th of February. Arguably anti-European as well. Isolationist in his stance, wants to walk away from the... And who is the man who is now the envoy for Ukraine is Dan Driscoll. All right, who is Dan Driscoll? He's the Secretary of the Army, knows nothing about Russia or Ukraine or Slavism. I mean, he's an investment banker.
As Secretary of the Army, he's responsible for technical issues in the Army. And as of last week, he's now the point person for President Trump, i.e. J.D. Vance, on Ukraine. So Vance and Driscoll, between them, are very anti-Ukraine, very sympathetic to the idea of just letting the Russians get on with it and get it off the table. And against them is Rubio, who does seem to feel this. And there's a power struggle going on between Rubio, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, and Vance, very powerful vice president, more powerful than most vice presidents have been in recent memory. And that struggle is turning the White House into a medieval court, and the chaos that is said to be happening at the White House has become almost legendary. And there's a lot of reporting on this in the States.
Let's just pause there for a second to go to our Moscow correspondent, Ivor Bennett, who's joining us now. And Ivor, we've been speculating here from hastily about what the reaction in Russia might be to this. You can tell us. I mean, has there been any official reaction to the fact that it seems that we're closer to a deal than we thought we were?
There hasn't, no, Jane, not yet. There hasn't been any reaction to these latest lines coming from the US media that Ukraine has supposedly agreed to something. But I'm not sure it actually changes that much, these lines, because we were hearing last night that Ukraine and America, or the American delegation, had kind of reached some sort of common ground on a new plan, and that's what this 19-point plan reportedly came from those talks in Geneva. And then we heard that the Americans were then going to present this plan to the Russians in Abu Dhabi today. But what have the Russians said about this? Not very much at all. There have been two instances. First of all, there was comments from the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, who gives daily briefings to journalists. Obviously, this was the key question: what's going on in Abu Dhabi? Who's there? What are the discussions focusing on? And all he said was that we are following these media reports. We have nothing to say yet, but we're following media reports, suggesting that he didn't even know about that. But that doesn't mean he doesn't, of course. He's just keeping stum at the moment, keeping very tight-lipped. And then I was at a press conference a couple of hours ago involving the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And he was asked again, what's happening in Abu Dhabi? Can you comment on this? And all he said was that that Moscow is maintains permanent communication with Washington and wouldn't be drawn on these reports specifically. But there are a couple of other things that have come out from Moscow in the last 24 hours that suggest that I'd say it's reluctance to agree to the new updated plan that's being reported, the one that Ukraine has supposedly agreed to. First of all, last night from Yuri Ushakov, who is Vladimir Putin's foreign policy advisor, a very senior figure. He was in Alaska with Lavrov, so a key part of the leadership structure. He said that what's being reported about this updated plan is not constructive and that it didn't work for them. No wonder, because of course this 19-point plan had removed all the contentious issues that had crossed all those Ukrainian red lines on territory, on cuts to its armed forces and on NATO membership. And then today, Lavrov again was asked in this press conference, what do you make of this, the reports of this updated plan? And he said this: if the spirit and letter of Anchorage, referring to the summit in Alaska between Putin and Trump in August, where supposedly the 28-point plan, the basis of that was agreed, if that's erased from the key understandings we've established, then of course the situation will be fundamentally different. Again, suggesting Russia's reluctance to agree to anything, and suggesting to me that their own red lines and their key demands have not changed. Still no sign of concession being made from Moscow.
Ivor, thanks very much. Really, really interesting. And as I was talking, we've also got the latest images that we can bring you of President Putin. Just to warn you that there's quite a lot of flash photography in these images, in case you are susceptible to that. President Putin arriving in Kyrgyzstan in the last few minutes. So Ivor Bennett there just reminding us what the Russians are saying about the potential that this peace deal has moved a step closer. Let's just return to our international correspondent, Alex Rossi, and Michael Clarke, our security and defence analyst, who are here in the studio with us. So interesting hearing what he said. Lavrov's been saying at this press conference today that he's referring back to Anchorage, seems to be wanting to roll back the diplomacy quite a long way.
Yeah, he said earlier on today, the spirit of Anchorage is no longer with us. Of course, Anchorage was a tremendous diplomatic victory for the Russians. And the other interesting thing is that Lavrov's back in the picture. Remember, he disappeared at the end of October because he seemed to mess up the phone call with Rubio. This, the Rubio-Lavrov phone call that was supposed to set up a Budapest summit for Putin and Trump went wrong because Lavrov pushed back too hard on it. He's disappeared. Last week, he appeared for the first time in a meeting with the Indian foreign minister, but he's been brought back now, it seems. I mean, this is his first statement on Ukraine all month. That's very unusual in certain circumstances. And that indicates to me, or suggests, that Putin is bringing his other big gun forward again. I mean, Lavrov has been punished for his indiscretion with being ignored and being put out in the cold for a while. And there's lots of rumours about, what's happened to Lavrov? Is he going to fall out of a window or anything like that? No, I mean, that's not the point. He's just, Putin indicated his displeasure by keeping Lavrov in the cold for a month. But he's brought him back for this. And, Lavrov will play a big role if there's real diplomacy in the next week over these issues, then Lavrov will be there. And it's interesting, today, as soon as I heard his name, I thought, yes. And I checked out, when was he last seen? Last week, first time since October the 30th. One appearance last week with the Indian foreign minister. Now he's back on the front line.
Interesting stuff, Michael. Thanks very much. We're going to bring you a lot more of this developing news story here on Sky News Today. Stay tuned, we're just going to take a short break. Welcome back. We're bringing you continuing coverage of the fact that there appears to have been some progress in the peace talks between Ukraine and Russia that America is brokering. We're hearing from American media that Ukraine has agreed to much of what was in the text of the agreement, but it has to be said that we also heard from Ukraine last night the very same thing. Let's speak to our US correspondent, David Blevins, who joins me now from the United States. David, what are the American media saying about any developments?
Well, Jen, I think it's fair to say that we have less of a breakthrough and more of a briefing at this point, and it is a coordinated briefing. The fact that various US networks were reporting in quick succession this morning here in Washington that Ukraine had backed the Trump-brokered peace plan tells us really that the administration wants to get this message out there, and you've got to ask why. Presumably it is because they believe by doing so they put pressure on the Russians to come closer to the table, despite there being no history of Russia ever buckling to that kind of diplomatic pressure. And I think it's really important to look at the wording as well. It's very vague. Terms like they have reached a common understanding or Ukraine supports the essence of an agreement. That is very far short of a deal. And we've seen so often in the past how President Trump seems to be able to negotiate terms with one side or the other, but not with both together at the same time. We also know, of course, that President Trump is preparing to depart Washington today for the other White House, as it's often described, Mar-a-Lago, his estate in Florida. He's going there for Thanksgiving, which is on Thursday, and is expected to stay there until Sunday, which is the last day of November. So it's interesting to note in the Ukrainian statement that they expect President Zelensky to meet with President Trump at the earliest date in November. That would suggest that the two may come face to face during the Thanksgiving holiday at Mar-a-Lago rather than in Washington. And I've been listening to Michael Clarke talking about how Zelensky will have to adopt a strong position in that meeting with Trump if the president appears to take the Russian position during any negotiations. And we've seen in the past how perhaps Volodymyr Zelensky can feel vulnerable in those situations. For example, after the showdown in the White House, the infamous showdown back in February, you will remember that it was European leaders who brought Trump and Zelensky together on the edge of Pope Francis' funeral. And then after the summit between Trump and Putin in the summer, those European leaders came en masse to Washington to support Zelensky. Last month, when the Ukrainian president was back in the White House again for talks, and there were reports of it having descended into a row, he emerged from the White House. Before he even came to brief us in the media, he went into a call with European leaders. So he does appear to rely on them a lot to have his back, and again, they may have a role to play in the coming days.
Indeed, Michael. David, thank you very much. Let's cross to Michael, our defence and security analyst, Professor Michael Clarke, who's with me now. So, Michael, David's talked us through a little bit about what could potentially happen in the next few days. How have we got to this point where there are reports that Ukrainians have potentially agreed something?
Well, I think, in big handfuls, as it were, this 28-point peace plan came out of the blue. It was secretly discussed in Miami last week. It suddenly emerged, and it wasn't a peace plan, it was a capitulation plan. It was basically Ukraine signing a surrender document, and President Trump suddenly said it's got to be done by Thanksgiving. The Europeans, I think, have had two victories here. One is that they've got rid of the deadline, and so this is obviously going to run beyond Thursday, thankfully, and it will go into, whatever, next week or whenever it might be, and probably quite a long way after that. So that's one victory. And the second victory, big one, is that they've converted this 28-point plan, which we now are pretty sure the Russians drafted, into a 19-point plan, which may or may not be acceptable, but at least it's not the 28-point plan. And it's a 19-point plan, which I think Ukraine would still find pretty hard to accept, but maybe they feel it's the lesser evil. So we're now talking about a different plan with a more relaxed timeline and a key meeting whereby President Zelensky and President Trump will sit down and go through the really tough parts of it. There's probably 4 or 5 issues, fundamental issues, like security guarantees. How big will the Ukrainian army be after some sort of peace? Do we have a ceasefire in place, or does Ukraine withdraw from some of the territory it now holds? Really big issues. And those 3 or 4, 5 issues, he will have to try to agree with President Trump. And if he comes away from that meeting with some form of words that they say, yeah, this is what we agreed to, then that version then, as it were, goes forward to the Russians, who will react to it.
Meanwhile, on the ground, the strikes are continuing from both sides.
Yes, the Russians lobbed 450 drones and 22 missiles last night at various parts of Ukraine, mainly Kyiv, though. I mean, Kyiv was hit quite heavily again. And the Ukrainians had over 200 drones, according to the Russians, 250. I think that might be an overestimate, but that's what the Russians say. And they hit facilities in Krasnodar and Rostov. And again, the Ukrainians are going for refining capacity and oil processing and oil and diesel processing plants. The Russians are going for energy infrastructure and civilian centres. So there's a difference in the sort of targeting, but they're both hitting each other I think the Ukrainians know that they're having an effect on the Russian economy now. They really are. It's not going to bring the economy to its knees, but it puts the Russians under strain if they're still in this position into the spring and early summer next year. But whether the Ukrainians can get through the winter with their energy being so severely hit as it is, and more civilian casualties, we'll see. They think they can, but I mean, they're now approaching the hardest part of the winter. So end of November to, let's say, end of February, they're approaching a 3-month period. And this will be their fourth winter, third winter, really, the one they started with at the end of February in 22. But their third winter under this sort of bombardment, and it'll be the toughest yet.
And Alex, you've spent time out in Ukraine with those fighting. I mean, what is their resolve like? I mean, every year I feel like we pose the same question: can they cope with another winter? Have they got the mental strength to keep going?
I think when it comes to the mental strength, undoubtedly, because they know that they have to cope with another winter. I mean, I think the other way of looking at this, particularly when it came to the original peace plan that was put forward, is could Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, actually accepted it? And I think the answer, you probably have some thoughts on this as well, is no, because he would have likely faced a military coup from inside his country. I mean, think of the amount of people who've made the ultimate sacrifice to hold the line in the Donbass. The idea that you would just give up territory that the Russians hadn't managed to win in 11 years of fighting. I mean, it's hard to countenance. And I don't think any Ukrainians would actually think that that was acceptable. So now here we are, obviously, with the 19-point peace plan. But I think the resolve in Ukraine is strong. They know that they have to keep fighting. I think the other fundamental difference between the Ukrainians and the Russians, despite Russia's characterization of this war, is for Ukraine, it really is an existential threat to the sovereignty of their country. Yes, they can make, and I think there is a recognition when you speak to Zelensky, you speak to his people, senior politicians, that when this does come to an end, they will have to make territorial concessions. But they can't make concessions over sovereignty, which brings us back, really, I think, to the thing that is absent in all of this. And this is the underlying cause of the war, the reason for Russia's aggression in the first place. It wants to bring Ukraine back into its orbit. It doesn't want to see colour revolutions. It doesn't want to see it march headlong towards democratic norms. And it wants to stop that. And I think that there is a strong argument that even if this peace plan, if you want to call it that, is successful in the short term, unless Russia achieves those goals, as long as President Putin is at the tip of the spear, they're likely to have another go.
I mean, the size of Ukraine, it's the biggest country in Europe, apart from Russia itself. The size of Ukraine eventually isn't the issue. The real issue is the freedom of Ukraine. Does Ukraine emerge from this war as a proper sovereign state, able to make its own decisions, whether they be to lean towards Moscow or lean towards the EU? That's up to them. But is it a strong, stable state, whatever Ukraine is? And, you know, how far it extends to the east or the southeast is not the main issue. There are big issues in that, but it's not the main issue. The main issue is the survival of a sovereign, free Ukraine.
And whether or not Putin may have inadvertently strengthened it by making this action.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, most nations, you know, build their inner resource through warfare. As it happens, just in history. You know, most nations are forged in war, one way or another.
It's the stories we tell ourselves, and the stories that Ukrainians will tell themselves now is that they were forged under the anvil of Russian imperialism, and it's a powerful, potent mix.
Absolutely.
It's a strong cocktail.
We're going to be continuing to talk about this after a short break. Don't go anywhere, you're watching Sky News. Hello, good afternoon. You're watching Sky News. We start with breaking news. And in the past hour, a Ukrainian official has told the Reuters news agency that they support the essence of a peace proposal brokered by the Trump administration following talks in Geneva at the weekend. Washington sent its initial 28-point peace plan to Kyiv last week before officials from both countries drafted a counter-proposal at crisis talks in Geneva. Meanwhile, Sir Keir Starmer said he spoke to President Zelensky this morning ahead of a virtual Coalition of the Willing meeting later this afternoon. Speaking in the Commons in the past hour, the Prime Minister said there was a tough road ahead to end the war, but that the UK was more committed than ever to the cause.
I welcome the continued efforts of the United States to end the war and stop the killing. The initial draft of the 28-point plan included points that were not acceptable, but also some very important elements that will be essential for a just and lasting peace. For example, it sets out steps on security guarantees from the US and partners. This is very significant, and the discussions in Geneva took important steps forward, with progress between the US and Ukraine on an updated peace framework. I can reassure the House that work is ongoing to refine this plan. Mr. Speaker, we're clear about the fundamental principles here, that Ukraine's sovereignty must be maintained, that Ukraine should be able to defend herself in future, and that matters about Ukraine and its future must be determined by Ukraine. We are clear their voice must always be at the heart of the process.
Responding for the Conservatives, Kemi Badenoch said Vladimir Putin and Russia must not be welcomed back into the international fold following any deal.
Putin's relentless bombardment of Kyiv and KGB-style negotiating tactics show he is not serious about peace, which is why Russia must not be welcomed back into the international fold without a comprehensive peace agreement. We all want this terrible war to end. And as the Prime Minister rightly said, elements of that draft 28-point plan were unacceptable. Conservatives are clear that the blanket surrender of Ukrainian territory would mean rewarding Putin's unprovoked aggression.
Well, let's talk now to our chief political correspondent, John Craig, who is in Westminster for us. So clear backing for Ukraine in the Commons today, John. And we've got this meeting this afternoon, another meeting of the Coalition of the Willing.
Yes, we expect that to start in the next half hour or so. The Prime Minister was on his feet in the Commons for an hour and a half. A lot of Labour MPs backing the Prime Minister. You heard their support from Kemi Badenoch as well. It's one issue on which the Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition are totally united. The PM also paid tribute to the work on Ukraine of the previous government as well. Now, you heard there the Prime Minister set out the conditions. There was a development really halfway through the statement when news began to come through of the reports perhaps that there had been a breakthrough. Now, I have to say there was scepticism amongst MPs about the significance of this, both from backbenchers and indeed the Prime Minister, who said his instinct was that perhaps what this referred to was the progress made in Geneva. Now, it was raised initially by a Labour MP, Alex Sobel, then a Tory MP, Mark Pritchard, got up and warned about the Ukrainians falling into a trap, being bounced into a deal. And the Prime Minister said, well, I spoke to President Zelensky 4 hours ago. He talked about probably speaking to him again today, possibly in that Coalition of the Willing meeting. He did say he'd come back if there was news of developments, but he seemed to suggest that the developments that are being reported are in fact the moves that were made in Geneva and not anything that's happened today. Now, as you might expect, domestic politics found a way into the discussions as well. Plenty of Labour MPs attacked Reform UK over the conviction of the Welsh leader Nathan Gill for taking bribes from the Russians. And the Prime Minister was happy to join in that and say Mr Farage should have launched an inquiry. At that point, the Deputy Speaker called Richard Tice, who got up very angrily and said that he'd made a 5-figure donation to Ukraine and he'd taken a truckload of aid there last year. And so he hit back at the attacks from Labour and indeed some Conservatives. But the Prime Minister told Mr Tice, you can't be pro-Putin and pro-Ukraine. So we may well hear more from the PM. I'd be very surprised if he came back and made another statement. But there is this meeting, and that's where we probably will get some developments. The Coalition of the Willing, of course, is chaired by the PM, by President Macron and Chancellor Merz of Germany. 36 nations in all involved. We're not sure, I don't think, at this stage whether President Trump or any others are going to take part in the discussions, but the PM certainly is obviously hoping that there are developments, perhaps, and there is a breakthrough. He did stress that there's a long way to go, and a cautious Prime Minister, as you might expect, on those reports that there has been a significant breakthrough.
John, thank you very much. Now, we don't yet know exactly the current state of the proposals that Ukraine are said to have agreed to, but these are some of the points that the European leaders were pushing for during talks in Geneva at the weekend. Among them, a security guarantee for Ukraine from the United States that mirrors NATO's Article 5 that states that an attack on one member is an attack on all. Ukraine would not be allowed to recover its occupied territory through military means, and negotiations on territorial swaps would begin at the present front line. The Ukrainian military would be capped at 800,000, but only in peacetime. According to the US plan, that cap would be 600,000, even in times of war. NATO would not permanently station its troops in Ukraine in peacetime, and Ukraine would be compensated financially through Russian assets, which would remain frozen until compensation had been paid. Plus, Ukraine would hold elections as soon as possible after the signing of any agreement. Well, let's talk to our US correspondent, David Blevins. And David, how much does President Trump need a breakthrough now on Ukraine?
Well, Jane, you will remember during the election campaign, Donald Trump vowed to end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours of taking office. He's been president of the United States for a year and 20 days, and yet that war rages on. So he's desperate for a breakthrough, not just because he doesn't want to be seen to fail on this issue, but because he is a man under increasing pressure at home. He's under pressure because of the Epstein files issue. You will remember he did a U-turn on that issue, having pledged to release the files, then his Attorney General telling his supporters there was nothing to see, until Congress rushed through a bill last week forcing the release of all files in the next 30 days. In fact, we're 7 days into those 30 now. He's also under pressure because of a split in his own MAGA base, one of his most vocal allies, Marjorie Taylor Greene, having parted company with the president over his stance on the Epstein files, but also because she says he has abandoned his principle of America first to concentrate on wars in the Middle East and Ukraine and elsewhere. He's under pressure because of cost of living issues at home. In fact, I think his latest approval rating is around 41%. A recent Reuters Ipsos poll put it at just 38%, the lowest of his second term. So you can begin to see why he is desperate for some kind of deflection, some kind of breakthrough on Ukraine. But right now it's not a breakthrough, it's just a briefing to various US networks with an administration official telling them that Ukraine is supporting the Trump brokered peace plan, but we've yet to see what that plan really looks like. It has been altered in recent days. All we know is that Ukraine is at least sending the right signals to the White House by indicating that President Zelensky is willing to come to this side of the Atlantic, either to Washington or more likely, I think, to Mar-a-Lago in Florida over the Thanksgiving holiday, to try and hammer out some sort of deal with President Trump. But even if they do, are they able to agree terms that will ever be acceptable to President Putin? That's another question altogether.
Indeed. Let's discuss that more. Thanks very much, David, with our defence and security analyst, Professor Michael Clarke, who is with me now, and also Alex Rossi, our international correspondent, who was in the studio. So, Michael, to you first of all, how significant do you feel it is that we've got to this point? Is it being a bit overblown here, or do you think this does sound like a real development?
Well, it's momentum. It's come out of nothing because, I mean, reportedly, this is on the back of the Gaza deal, and I mean, President Trump came back from Gaza feeling pretty high, and rightly so. There were some achievements there that I think they're probably slipping away, but at the time there were achievements. And reportedly, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and Steve Witkoff, his great friend, were on the plane together, and they were saying, look, we've got to take this success onto Ukraine now. We've got to do the same thing for Ukraine, using the same technique that we got some success with Gaza. And you can see the way that has worked out. And so while other things were going on last week, Steve Witkoff was talking quietly to Kirill Dmitriev, has become a friend of Witkoff's over the months. I mean, Dmitriev is the leader of the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Russia, so he's an industrialist. He's a fixer. He's a money man, not really a politician. So two money men talked together in Miami for about a week and then came up with this draft. And then, I mean, Witkoff may feel he's got a very special friendship with Dmitriev, but as soon as they had this draft, which is essentially a Russian draft, Dmitriev leaked it. That's how much of a friend he is. And with leaking the draft, that put a cat among the pigeons, and here we are this week, talking about a sort of diplomatic crisis. But it's possible, all crises are moments of opportunity. It's possible that something quite surprising will come out of this. But on the face of it, this looks like as if we're going around the same circuit as before, whereby what the Russians want is completely different to what the Ukrainians feel they can agree to, and that the Russians will find reasons why they can't engage in a proper peace process because ultimately they want to continue the war.
And Alex, in terms of what's happening in Europe, we've had statements from Clarke and Alex today continuing to back Ukraine. I mean, it seems Europe is resolute in its support.
Europe is resolute, but Europe is also fighting back from being on the back foot. I mean, Michael mentioned the leaking of the document, and from the Russians' point of view, that was an absolute masterstroke, because here you are having to claw back the initiative on something that's really going the wrong way, and they have managed to do that. For instance, they've managed to overturn this deadline of Thanksgiving, which was on Thursday. There now appears to be a bit more breathing space. But yeah, we've heard from the Vice President of the European Commission, Kaja Kallas. She's saying that actually the original points in that 28-point peace plan completely unacceptable. There can be no way back for the Russians, and it cannot be business as usual, because there needs to be an acknowledgement and I suppose some sort of reparations that the Russians started a war of aggression and invaded another sovereign country. And until there is that recognition, there can be no way back, no membership or entry back into the G8. It can't be business as usual.
And if there's no way back for the Russians, there's no way back for the rest of us in Europe either, because it's our neighbourhood. So in other words, I mean, Kaja Kallas's point, a point a number of analysts have made, not least me, is that since 2022, everything has changed. Everything has changed. We'll never get back to where we were in 2018 or 2019. That's gone. So we've got to rethink European security on the basis that the Russians have crossed a line, that Putin is personally committed, not just to absorbing Ukraine, but to overturning the security architecture of Europe that we've had since 1945.
I mean, you have to go back to the underlying causes of all of this. And I think if there is a moment that you could look into President Putin's mind and understand that mindset, I think it's after the collapse of the Cold War, where he described that as the great, one of the greatest geopolitical catastrophes of the 20th century. He was not talking about the death of communism. He was talking about the fact that Russia was this huge empire, and that effectively is what the Ukraine war is about in essence. It's about reeling back a country into Russian, the Russian sphere of influence, the Russian orbit.
And when the Soviet Union collapsed into 15 successor states, Ukraine was the first one to go. In effect, it wasn't technically the first one. Estonia was technically the first one. But Ukraine was the first of the big successor, the provinces, as it were, the states of the Soviet Union, to just want to be independent. And, Moscow's never forgiven Kyiv for that. You broke up the Soviet Union. You, the Ukrainians, were in the forefront. They've never forgiven them.
Really interesting to talk to you both. We're going to continue our rolling coverage of this story. Stay with Sky News, rolling coverage of a potential breakthrough in the Ukrainian-Russian war.